Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. I'd ask everyone in the public gallery to switch off their electronic devices or switch to silent mode so we don't affect the committee's work. We have received apologies from our convener, Jenny Mara, and from Colin Beattie. And I welcome John Mason, who is attending in place of Colin Beattie this morning. Item 1 on our agenda is a decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 3 and 4 in private? Yeah. Thank you. Item 2 on our agenda is a Section 22 report, the 2018-19 Audit of Disclosure Scotland. May I welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. We have Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland. Good morning. Gemma Diamond, Audit Director, Performance Audit and Best Value, Audit Scotland. Good morning. And Gary Devlin, Partner of Scott Moncrieff. Good morning. Auditor General, may I invite you to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. Very briefly, Disclosure Scotland performs two main functions. It carries out disclosure checks on criminal histories for employers, and it manages the Protection of Vulnerable Groups scheme, which protects children and vulnerable adults. I should put on record that Disclosure Scotland's 2018-19 accounts were unqualified. My report details the history of Disclosure Scotland's new Protecting and Safeguarding Scotland programme. Disclosure Scotland completed the transfer of all its activities to this new system on 25th September 2019, 5 days before the system it replaced closed down. The most recent estimate for the cost of the past programme is £78.5 million. As illustrated in Exhibit 1 of my report on page 5, this is significantly above the estimates in the outline business case approved by the Scottish Government in October 2015 and in the subsequent full business case. Further, the system that's currently in operation is described as a minimum viable service and lacks some of the functionality originally envisaged. Manual workarounds are still required. My report details a number of issues that the programme experienced. In summary, these relate to too lower level of optimism bias being applied to a complex and innovative programme, a lack of financial reporting and oversight, ambiguity over the role of the various governance groups overseeing the programme, and a limited amount of contingency planning. Gary Devlin and Gemma Diamond will do our best to help me answer the committee's questions, Convener.
Thank you. Willie Coffey.
Convener, good morning. Auditor General, it feels like Groundhog Day once again. Here's another IT project coming to the attention of this committee with what looks like similar problems to all the previous examples that we've seen here. Could you give us any kind of indication what in particular went wrong with this software development programme?
I share that frustration, Mr. Coffey. As you know, I've reported on a number of failed IT programmes over my time as Auditor General. In 2016, we published a set of principles for digital programmes, and a number of those principles weren't applied in this case. There's no guarantee that they would avoid any problems arising, but I think they do certainly increase the likelihood of success in programmes of this type. So I think, as always, the starting point is the overall governance and management of the programme from the beginning. Gemma was the author of that set of principles, and she might want to give you just a bit more colour of that before we get into the specifics of the programme itself.
Absolutely. I think that the themes coming through this report on Disclosure Scotland's programme absolutely all feature within the principles document around about governance and optimism bias, and the importance of having those things in place from the very start. We've often talked about that when we talk about digital programmes, is that actually those good behaviours and processes and systems need to be in place from the very start and all the way through. The Disclosure Scotland programme does have a slightly longer history in that it started before our principles document did publish, but when the document published, it was in the kind of main delivery stage of the programme, and we would have expected those principles to be adhered to better than they were.
In this example, and in recent discussions, Convener, we've heard about the agile development methodology, which seems to be the development methodology that suits most software development projects these days, which we hear about, and it was deployed, as I understand it, in this case, but the project still, I won't say hesitate to failed. It's just the initial estimate dropped and then increased back to the initial forecast some way. So there's something going on with these software development programs that we need to get to the bottom of. in my experience, if you don't do the work at the front end of a piece of software development, there's no guarantee that you're going to get what you want at the end of it. So do you think we have the people in place who can understand and are capable of specifying the technical requirements of a piece of software within these organisations that we have some control over?
I'll kick off by saying we think Agile was an appropriate methodology to use for this programme. It was complex, it was innovative, using cloud technology. The first time police data has been used in this way, and it should eventually really improve the service to the people requiring disclosures. So Agile was appropriate. But as I say on page 9 of my report, there was limited experience of using the methodology in the various governance groups involved within Disclosure Scotland. And that's a problem we've seen before, people thinking they're using an Agile methodology and in fact not understanding what rigour it requires. Gemma, do you want to build on that?
Absolutely. I think one of the key things we've seen before is that particularly at a kind of strategic level, those leaders and those governance boards who are overseeing the programme need to understand the Agile methodology, need to understand the kind of information they should expect to receive. With the Agile methodology, there's actually a lot of information that's produced and a lot of monitoring reporting that is produced. And I think what we've seen here is that the governance boards it wasn't clear in terms of what information was going to what board and what decision making was in place at each board. The Agile methodology is designed so that it's an iterative process and you find out things as you go and things change as you go, and we understand absolutely that this was a very complex situation and things would change as they go along. What we would have expected to see is more transparent reporting alongside that went along with how much was going to cost, what the key decisions were and what changes that meant to the whole process more regularly throughout the programme.
I mean, the company involved here, BGSS, have a really good reputation and a good track record in deploying this kind of technology. So it can't be that, in my view. There has to be some other element going on here. And for me, I think, convener, it's about the skills that are within the department that's commissioning the software. Again, it's the lack of skills in there, in my view, that may be giving rise to this. But what happened in terms of sponsorship? You know, this is a particular piece of software which should have been under the gaze of the sponsoring departments to try to intervene at as early a stage as possible to prevent this kind of thing going on. What happened there in terms of oversight and sponsorship from the government department?
Darren, do you want to pick that up?
In terms of sponsorship, if we go to if you look at Exhibit 1 and the full business case extension that happened in September 2018, at that point, the sponsor department was starting to become concerned about progress in implementing the PASS system. Part of that was the escalating costs, and part of the escalating costs was around programme management. So the Scottish Government sponsor department, through the Fraser figure in Scottish Government, nominated a member of the Scottish Government team to sit in the Transformation Programme Board. And that individual was reporting back to the sponsorship department. So Scottish Government at that point were reflecting on a programme that was starting to become higher risk in terms of delivery and cost.
Do those people have the kind of software development skills that we kind of need at the front end of any development project to get it right? Have they,
so maybe
or are they managers,
just,
or
yeah.
what are they? What are their skills?
If you reflect on what the Section 22 report is saying, you're absolutely right. So you need these skills at the outset, in the planning stage, on the client side. And it's clear that the senior leadership teams and the governance groups did not follow the best practice guidelines on implementing governance in an agile project. And there is really good guidelines in place for how you do that. Examples of that would be experts in managing agile projects not being on the team, the governance groups, the role of each governance group not being specified adequately so that there's clarity over governance and who is accountable and who is exercising scrutiny and assurance. And the final part of that is training for the senior leadership team so that everyone who's exercising governance understand agile and are confident enough to raise some of these queries. The individual that the Scottish Government inserted into the Transformation Programme Board, I would have said did have that level of experience. But at that point, you're significantly into the programme, and some of the issues are baked in.
That kind of leads me to the question about why aren't these people involved at the outset? I mean, from becoming involved in 2018, but the outline business case started in 2015. They have to be in at the start, surely. They seem to come in when it's going wrong, rather than being in at the beginning to specify it and get it right.
I think Gemma's response on the national report that Audit Scotland's prepared around good governance in digital projects would say that you need to look very carefully at the skills and resources and capacity of any organisation implementing a major transformation programme, particularly an innovative IT project, and you need to do this at the outset. Because if you don't make those good decisions and good governance decisions at the outset, it follows you throughout the programme, and that's unfortunately what's happened here.
A common message, Convener, that we've heard so many times now. Who's next? Is there any way you, us, or otherwise can ask about what's on the horizon in terms of IT and make sure that these management processes are embedded in place at the start and the outset of these projects to give them a realistic chance of success?
I'm very much hoping that I don't have to report on another IT project during my time as Auditor General. The committee knows, I think, that the government's Digital Directorate has set up a register of major projects which it is using to prioritise its own engagement with the large projects as they're being developed from the beginning, as you're suggesting. Gemma, I don't know if there's anything more you can say about that.
Absolutely. When we brought our report on enabling digital government to the committee back in June 2019, we talked there about the changes that had been made to the assurance process for oversight of digital programmes. But we also talked there about the government needing to have better processes to be able to prioritise which programmes needed support. And also we talked about the skills shortage as well, and therefore how do you prioritise where those skills go within the central government sector and across all of these programmes, and there needs to be better kind of collaboration across the sector to be able to share those skills. We also raised in that report that the government hadn't had enough resource to be able to share lessons learned from all of these assurance reviews, so that while assurance reviews were being undertaken on individual programmes, there was nothing that brought out those common lessons and built that into training programmes for future leaders and for future people working on those programmes. So we saw that as quite a significant risk for helping to prevent these the same things happening on future programmes.
So you're content that the guidelines that you described there, Gemma, should be sufficient to allow any department, any agency to do this right next time round, if they follow the guidelines? There's nothing missing, do you think, from the digital skills guidelines that we've put in place?
So I think the guidance is there, and there is training and support there. I think what there is a skills shortage, and there is not enough of that skilled resource to go around. There are a significant number of digital programmes and digital transformation undertaken across the whole of the public sector at the moment, and our report last year raised that there needed to be better collaboration so that you can ensure that the right skills go to the right places, and that is something that is applicable across the whole of the public sector.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Convener.
And that's sour.
Just on the skills part, Gemma Diamond, I think you're right. I mean, you're obviously right around the skills gap within the public sector. Is there a hesitancy to go out and find those relevant skills, either in terms of headhunting someone into the public sector or using where those skills exist in the private or voluntary sector, or is it just a skills gap across the board, across Scotland, across all three sectors?
We see much more now that the public sector are bringing in appropriate skills from the private sector, bringing in as kind of on a consultant basis on short-term contracts, but there is absolutely a shortage across the whole market in certain skill areas. And we raised in the report last year around about the Scottish Government still finds it very difficult to compete on a salary basis with the private sector to be able to bring in those skills, particularly in markets such as Edinburgh and Glasgow, where you have very strong kind of financial services organisations who are looking for similar skills as well. So it is a kind of widespread issue.
Because we clearly have an IT skills gap, not just in Scotland, to be frank. I mean, if you look at governments across the UK, IT projects are always a huge challenge in terms of going over budget, taking far too long, and a massive skills gap. Are there international examples that we can learn from around how to do IT skills much better, or is this a global problem as well as a UK problem?
When we did the principles report back in 2017, we looked internationally to kind of see, was this something that was unique to Scotland? Was it common across public sector across the world? And it was kind of both reassuring and slightly pessimistic in that this happens across the public sector, and the same issues auditors around the world are raising the same issues. I think there will be developments internationally that the Scottish Government can look to, particularly in places like Australia that have had very similar issues, projects that have had difficulties and some of the arrangements that they've put in place, to see how that has helped them to solve them some of the same challenges.
Are we getting a sense that the same challenges exist to the same extent in the private sector as well? Are they having the same problems as we're having in the public sector?
I think we can see that there are absolutely some of the same challenges. We see some of that with some of the banks and some the IT failures that happen there, and the impact on customers. When we were looking for information, there's not the same level of information to find out in terms of what went wrong and why it went wrong on some of those private sector failures.
Thank you.
Thank you. Willie Coffey asked about the issues at the start of this project, and before I bring in John Mason to drill into the costs aspect specifically, at the start of this project there were two key areas that mistakes appear to be made. Firstly on the costs, and secondly on the timescale. Do you have any sense of why that's come about?
Gary may well want to add to this in a moment. I think one of the key questions is the process that led to the overall cost, or the estimated cost of the programme, reducing from 77 million in June 2015 to 34 million in October of that year. We know that part of the difference was reducing the optimism bias to the minimum allowed under the Green Book guidance. That's clearly a very risky decision to take for a system of this complexity, innovation and importance to the running of the organisation. Beyond that, we don't know, I think, very much about what else led to the reduction, but that has to be an important question. My sense is that we are more concerned about the reduction in the costs than we are about the timescale. This was innovative. The problems became apparent relatively early on and were dealt with in rescoping the work and redesigning what happened. But I think, as you say in your question, convener, that very starting point of did we have a good baseline for this is one of the important ones for me. Gary, do you want to add to that?
Maybe only two things to add to the Auditor General's comments. The key aspect of this is optimism bias. When you're starting off in an innovative, complex, major transformation programme which is IT-led, you will inevitably face challenges throughout that programme, and that will, over time, add to cost. You don't know what they are at the outset, and that's why you include an optimism bias. An optimism bias in this case was not set at the appropriate level for an innovative, complex, large-scale project of this type, in our view. And I think that's quite clear. And you can see that from the initial business case, which is 77 million, to the kind of outline business case, which dropped significantly to around the 35 million mark. And you end up, broadly speaking, at where you started in terms of cost. The other aspect of that is set out in paragraph 11 on page 6 of the report. So the key elements of additional cost are really related to the additional capital cost of finding when you're faced with complex challenges throughout the project, how you address those add to cost, and those were 10.4 million. The BT contract had to be extended, and the BT contract was very expensive, much more expensive than the past system will be to operate going forward, and that is costing an additional 5.8 million. And then there is 6 million additional cost for the manual workarounds. That broadly explains the move from the full business case number to the final number.
Gary, Gary, thank you for that. Would you mind there'll be people watching that are saying, what's this optimism bias and how on earth can it impact something to the tune of 30 odd million? Would you mind in layman's terms just explaining very briefly how that works, please?
So when you set out on any complex project of any description, not necessarily an IT project, you know at the start that you don't know everything that's going to happen. So in a major building project, you don't know what you'll find when you dig up the ground and do groundworks. You don't know what complex challenges you might find in terms of the architecture of a system or a building. This building here, for example, is a really good example of some of the unknowns at the start of a project. Over time, developers of systems have identified this as a key issue. And in program management, when you're about to invest significant amounts of money, whether you're in the private sector or in the public sector, the standard practice is to assess the risks associated with the project. Has this been done before? Often. And you can be much more confident about cost. Or is this new, innovative, never done before, and you are less certain about costs? And there is a spectrum of allowances that you make in your budgeting to cover for those unknowns. And that's called optimism bias. You tend, because you're vested as management in this project, and often when you're getting to the point of initiating a project, you're very keen on doing it. You've convinced yourselves that this is a great thing to do. And management tend to be optimistic about the outturn. And it's to compensate for management's human beings' natural instincts to err on the side of the best possible outcome. And that's what this does. It forces you in a logical way to factor in unknown costs into your budgeting.
Helpful, thank you. John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, maybe just to kind of continue that line of thinking, it says the Treasury, this is paragraph 21, page 8, the Treasury Green Book sets out good practice for optimism bias, is that right? And then it appears that there's a range, because it says in 22, adopted the lowest level allowed for this type of programme. So it sounds like they were within the parameters, but had gone too far down.
Yes, so there were a number of elements to this. The minimum range is 10%. The maximum range for a highly innovative programme is 200% of cost for optimism bias. The way that the guidelines say that you should address this is by starting at the upper level and justifying why you should decrease the optimism bias at all, at any level. Disclosure Scotland did not go through that process. So there is no evidential documented way in which they arrived at the minimum level. And given that this is a highly innovative project, which we've said, we would have expected them to be much closer to the higher number, the maximum number, than the lower number for a project of this
And would
type.
there have been any check or third party looking at what Disclosure Scotland were saying at that time? Or is it only that we're all looking at it in retrospect?
I think there should have been more challenge and more scrutiny at that point, and that may well have picked up the optimism bias issue.
The government rejected the initial 77.2 million, presumably as being too expensive, although we ended up at 78.5. So they went back with 34.1. Now, if I said, well, I'd like to buy this house and it's 200,000, and I said, that's a bit much, and they came back and said 90,000, I'd be pretty suspicious that there weren't going to be any electricity in it, or the walls were going to be weak, or something. I mean, surely government, or whoever approved this, such a dramatic drop in cost should have been questioned.
So I think we would agree that scrutiny and assurance levels at that point didn't work in this case as well as they should have.
And I would say that that's both the government and the governance groups within Disclosure Scotland. We say in paragraph 14 that there were 4 groups that should have had a role, and actually none of them appear to have been applying the sort of challenge that Gary's talking about. They felt they were managing the project rather than challenging it.
Okay, and as I think Willie Coffey mentioned, I mean, we started at 77.2, went down to this unrealistic level, and we ended at 78.5. Is it just coincidence that the 77 and the 78 are close together?
It is actually, although in a way it's not surprising because the initial business case had a higher level of optimism bias factored in.
So that, yes. So and that the optimism bias would cover anything. I mean, it would cover all sorts of things going wrong in a sense.
Yes, it would have covered, if you'd have gone for the highest level, it would have covered a significant proportion of the overspend.
I think it's also coincidental in the sense that if you look at Exhibit 2, although Disclosure Scotland have a system up and running that does what's required, it is a minimum viable system. They haven't got some of the things they were hoping for at the point of the initial business case. And you can see that the gap there, which is requiring to be covered by manual workarounds to make it work at all, and above the dotted line, the ambition they had for what they were hoping to achieve when the initial business case was put together. So the numbers are similar, but they've actually got less for the 78 million that they've spent so far.
So that's the Exhibit 2 that you've got. Yeah, I was trying to kind of compare it with Exhibit 1. Now, that's the present position, or at least when this report was written. I mean, is there still space for the system to improve going forward?
There is, Gary.
Back to closer to where it was meant to be?
Yes, but there will require to be additional investment. So the manual workarounds are currently costing just now about 2.7 million. The manual workaround cost will reduce to about 2.14 million. The manual workarounds are in place to enable you to get to the core solution. If you look at Exhibit 2 on page 7, it quite graphically shows that. And the capital budget gap for Disclosure Scotland for this year is 9.5 million. And that's broadly an indication of the amount of capital investment that would still be required to remove the manual workarounds. In addition to that, the disclosure bill is going through Parliament. As you know, I think it's just been passed, in fact. So that will change again the requirements and processes required to process the disclosures. So there will be a further change in addition to a core solution. And just to finish off on the Auditor General's point, that is still some way from achieving the initial ambition for the project, which was all digitised and a much more functional system.
So that's now unachievable?
No, I wouldn't say it's unachievable. It will simply cost more capital to achieve.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Just on that line of questioning, John Mason was asking, and I quite like the analogy about the house. So, there's a business case put out, it comes back suddenly cheaper, and you've said in your report at page 5, the Scottish Government approved the revised projected costs of 34 million. Are you able just to tell us which department of the Scottish Government signed and sealed this?
Is the Justice Department.
The Justice Department.
Yeah, the Disclosure Scotland forms part of the Justice Department.
Thank you. Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Just before I ask my questions, I mean, I looked around to find some information on Disclosure Scotland, and it led me to a sort of subset of the Scottish Government website where their information is. And, I looked for board minutes. There was only minutes were September 2019, Audit Committee November 2018, 2018 annual accounts. Do you look at all at, I mean, there must be more minutes than that.
So one of the issues that Audit Scotland has raised and raises continuously is around transparency of public bodies. Government agencies do not have to publish minutes of audit committees and board meetings in the same way as other public bodies do, or many other public bodies do. And there is a variety of approaches to publishing minutes of meetings. We have raised this issue as the local auditor with Disclosure Scotland to say that they should consider being more transparent.
Transparent. There's obviously more up-to-date information they just haven't put there. And I noticed also in the minutes that were there were redacted items. Is that common to have?
So it's common if you're dealing with commercial and confidence issues.
I mean, interestingly, one of the chief executive's, key points was to do with climate change, and that the board lunches will no longer contain meat. I mean, it doesn't sound like the sort of issue of a body like this should be has a prime.
I mean, that is worth something you could put to the accountable officer and Scottish Government.
Okay. So coming back to the more, you might say mundane. I mean, the report is concerning in relation to the financial oversight, and it states that no financial information was provided to the Transformation Project Board, even though it's been responsible for authorising the expenditure, and there was no evidence that the additional budget was required for the project was formally approved by any of Disclosure Scotland's governance groups. So was there never a discussion within the Transformation Project Board about who should be scrutinising the budget? And I mean, the Scottish Government was on that board.
One of the things that the report says, so if you go to paragraph 14 and the subsequent paragraphs, it says that they had never properly defined the roles of the 4 separate governing bodies. As a result, there was some confusion over roles in governing this project, and that confusion comes through. In answer to your question, I think when there is confusion, lots of governance groups assume some other governance group is managing the scrutiny and assurance aspects. And in this case, scrutiny and assurance was not sufficient for a programme of this type and scale.
I mean, I usually ask about what the Audit Committee were doing, and I see that it was, at their request, that there was some information put together for the board on this. But I think it was at November 18, they extended the contract with BT until the end of September 19. Now, perhaps you'd have thought that having to budget or look at these costs would have, raised the profile a bit and got people looking at it more.
So yes, is the answer to that. Of course, yes. And so my understanding, I attend the Audit Committee of Disclosure Scotland, and certainly the Audit Committee were asking questions, and it comes through in the annual report. It's one of these issues when you look at a public body and you look at the governance that's in place, you would tick boxes to say it looks as though, on paper, adequate governance is in place because they have a transformation programme board, they're reporting to a board, you have a leadership team, and you have an audit committee. On paper, that looks as though it should be fine. The issue being that not all of those governance groups are clear about what the roles are in relation to this programme. And the Audit Committee felt the need to step in to start to receive more detailed financial and other information late in the project because it was becoming clear that that information wasn't going through the other governance groups.
I saw a reference, I think, maybe in the board minutes to internal audit. Who is internal audit?
It's the Scottish Government internal audit team.
Right, and do you have any comment on their performance in this?
None. I mean, the internal audit team undertook a review about a year ago now and reported many of the issues that come out through the Auditor General's report.
To whom did they report?
They reported to the Audit Committee.
And the Audit Committee passed that on to the board?
Yes, so the accountable officer sits on the Audit Committee, and the Audit Committee members also sit on the board.
So things were
or many of them do, not all of them do, but many of them do.
Things were known about, things got reported, but it didn't come to a consequence or nothing.
So there was confusion over roles in the individual governance groups which hampered effective scrutiny of this project.
It's probably worth also mentioning the impact of the hard deadline of BT's involvement, that the work was being carried out on a BT platform that had been in place for a long time. It was expensive, as Gary has described, and Disclosure Scotland wanted to expand what it could do as well as reduce costs. The BT contract was extended at one point during this programme when it became clear that the past programme wouldn't be available in time. BT then made it clear they wouldn't extend again, and that meant that had there not been a system in place, it's not at all clear how these very important disclosures would have been handled. And I think that may have also led to a focus not on what's the right thing to do, but on we must get this system up and running.
Delivering the service, and the consequence of that would have been even worse than, if you like, the finance. For those involved, and we've heard all the issues, has there been any consequence to anyone as a result of this, for this not going well?
Depends on depends on what you mean by consequence. I mean, certainly there has been... yes, in late 2018, 2019, there has been significantly greater challenge around this. It's highly unusual for, well, is it highly unusual? It's certainly unusual for Scottish Government sponsored department to insert a member of staff to oversee or to support the scrutiny of a transformation programme board and report directly back to Scottish Government. And in a sense, that would have sent signals to the senior leadership team in Disclosure Scotland about the importance of managing this project better and delivering it on time. The consequences of not doing so would have been really quite significant.
We don't seem to have any mention of departures from boards or leadership teams.
That's not happened to my knowledge to date.
No. Okay.
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah, I've got two questions. First of all, as Gemma said, the principles outlined by yourself, Auditor General, in 2016 were not adhered to in this case. And that was obviously a contributing factor to what ended up as a bit of a disaster in terms of the cost and how the project went. Is there now, and furthermore, the Scottish Government representative on the project board wasn't appointed effectively until well into the process. Is it not time the Permanent Secretary issued an order, if I can put it as crudely as that these principles must be adhered to, and that the minute a project board is set up for an IT project, there must be a relevant Scottish Government official, qualified Scottish Government official on that board from day one?
I think it's fair to say that it's hard for us to understand why we keep on seeing failures of this scale due to some of these very basic, not easy, but basic requirements that should be in place. As Gemma said earlier, the outline business case predated our publication of the principles document, but nonetheless, what we were doing was codifying what was already known rather than producing something brilliant out of the ether ourselves. So I think there's still there's some substance to your point. Gemma, can you say a bit more about the way the government is promoting those for the committee to think about what else might be required?
Absolutely. So our report last year from June, Enabling Digital Government, set out the assurance arrangements that the Digital Directorate has in place for all major digital programmes that go throughout the lifetime of a programme. So they are now designed to look at the programme from its very inception and at key points along that journey of a programme. And certainly we have seen that these principles are written into that guidance, essentially, that bodies have to follow and have to now show that they are adhering to through that assurance process. And that assurance process, if it doesn't get enough assurance at those particular points, does have the power to stop a programme for remedial action before it then carries on. So that assurance process is still quite new and still finding its feet in some way. And also there is... it comes back to skills and capacity in terms of having enough people with the right skills to be able to look in detail at the assurance of these programmes. And also volume-wise, there's a significant number of digital programmes going on across government. So government needs to have enough capacity of people with the right skills to be able to scrutinise all of those programmes. And we raised in that report that it needed better processes to look at how it prioritises that skills and capacity so it can effectively do that scrutiny and challenge role and undertake that assurance process across all the digital programmes in place.
So are you saying, Gemma, basically any new project right at the beginning, even from business case being approved stage, you would be fairly comfortable that the principles now would be filled? I take the point about capacity, and clearly the government has to build its own capacity in terms of having the properly qualified and appropriately qualified people who can actually sit on the project board and so on. I take that point. But in terms of at least attempting to ensure that the principles are going to be followed, you're comfortable that that's now the case?
Certainly the assurance process that's in place does cover the heart of these principles and look at it at different gates. The assurance process isn't for all digital programmes. We've talked before about it being for those that are high risk or over 5 million. So there are some of the smaller ones that do not get covered by that assurance programme. So it's certainly not for the whole whole suite of digital programs that are in place.
Before the projects under 5 million can still go awry and cost the public sector a fair amount of money. So is there a need for perhaps maybe not such a complicated or complex set of principles to be applied or insurance programme for smaller projects, but something akin to it that makes sure that even projects under 5 million, because if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 projects under 5 million and the average say 3 million, and that's £15 million, and they're all out by 50% or 100%, that's potentially £15 million overrun for the public sector, money we can't afford and taxpayers shouldn't be asked to have to fork out for those mistakes. So is there not a need for some kind of similar parallel programme for the smaller projects that doesn't use up inappropriate levels of resource?
We certainly raised that the Scottish Government really needs to think about how it prioritises its resource and so it's best directed at those programmes that really need it, and that might be at some of the smaller ones that are under the 5 million but that are high risk in delivering a service to direct to the public, but also those smaller bodies we know really struggle to get the right skills and capacity in place. They are very unlikely to have that skills and capacity already there and will need to get that from somewhere, and they can really struggle with that. So certainly that is something that we've said the Scottish Government needs to look at. There is a limited resource. Certainly there are over 300 digital programmes that the Scottish Government, the Digital Directorate, has on its list. It does need to prioritise where it best places that its skills and capacity and its resource. There's also now, they are building up the training programmes that are available for all public sector leaders and people undertaking these digital programmes. And we think, again, it's essential that the lessons learned from these programmes are built into those training programmes so that, again, these lessons are shared more widely.
Is there a need for one of the things, and first of all, can I say we all recognise the dire shortage across the economy, across the world, of people with IT skills. So clearly the Scottish Government, to be fair to the Scottish Government, is operating in that context. And it's good that they're trying to do something to expand general capacity as well as their own capacity. But is there not a need to have some kind of core team who are expert? I mean, I like picking up Willie Coffey's point. I got a background in the computer industry a number of years ago internationally, and this was a problem internally in the computer industry where you were getting the IT department to set up a program to manage order flow, for example. If you didn't specify fairly precisely right at the beginning of the process what you needed as the customer of the internal IT department, it usually ended up in a disaster. And the expertise required for that is quite specific. And is there not a need for a team at the centre with the expertise on specifying, what's required of a new IT programme? Because it seems to me, it's a different team every time. Depending on which organisation it is, they pull together a new team every time. If you had a central team, there was a central resource that people could call on, then, as Willie Coffey says, that starting point, which is absolutely, it's like building a house. It's like building this place. The overrun was primarily due to the fact we didn't properly specify the design work right up front.
So the Digital Directorate is trying to build up that capacity and expertise within the Digital Directorate so it can support the various programmes as they require it. Again, it comes back to, the capacity of that in terms of having enough to be able to service the need that is out there. And also to make sure that they have the right information about those programmes so that they can provide the support as needed.
If I can just add to that briefly, Convener, the committee might remember the report that Gemma referred to from last year, Enabling a Digital Future, which aimed to summarise the big programmes that are currently on the government's register. And there are some really big peaks in that, particularly to do with social security. And I think that at the moment there is a trade-off. We recognise that. The social security work seems to be being managed well. It's being delivered to cost and time broadly. Some questions for the future as it ramps up. But I think the government would say it's making decisions about where to prioritise. The bigger question is where the skills come from and how to prioritise what it is that they're supporting.
If you look at a small country like Estonia, they're miles ahead of all of us in all of this stuff. Maybe we need to send a team to Estonia and just copy what Estonia is doing.
Send a virtual team to Estonia. Via
Absolutely. Just in a separate point and very quickly, building on Bill Bowman's point about, and we heard from about Bord na Gaelic last week, you know, where minutes in agendas and all that sort of stuff are not even on the website, and you know, which I think is crazy. I mean, as you know, under our wider remit, we're looking at freedom of information legislation, its implementation. Should the Permanent Secretary of the Government not be making it absolutely clear to every public body that in this day and age, their minutes, their agendas, their papers, unless there is something like confidential disclosure issues. But generally speaking, all of these things should timiously be on their website and easily accessible by the general public.
There's a need for some sort of push by government. As Gary said, it's something auditors look at routinely. We produced last year some guidance on what auditors should be doing and briefed the committee on that. On board, the guidance for public bodies sets out expectations. They're applied differently, I think, in different bodies. Auditors can only recommend, they can't require bodies to do things. What you see here is the instances where something else has gone wrong and the openness and transparency is one of the contributory factors. I think it probably links to the variation we've talked about before in the way in which sponsor figures and Fraser figures carry out their responsibilities and the expectations they're setting. I think it would be timely to have a push on that.
Okay, thank you.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much. Again, Convener Caroline, I wanted to ask if we seek the views, the perspective of the external software contractors in these projects and any others, just to get their sense of what's going wrong. Now, this company is really good, great reputation, Queen's Award, and so on and so forth. So it would be useful, I think, for us to hear just what their perspective is on these issues and any others that might follow.
I'm pretty sure this was a two-phase process, and I think Gary can tell you a bit more about that.
Firstly, I think that's a great point, and I think they are an integral part of improving how we deliver IT projects. BGSS were involved in supporting Disclosure Scotland. In fact, they were part of, a significant part of the partnership delivery team for this project, and did help design the second stage or phase of this in terms of it really laser focus on how you ensure delivery by the September 2019 drop dead deadline. And in that sense, they were very helpful to Disclosure Scotland in managing that. You always have to be careful with commercial side companies because they have a vested interest in an outcome with a profitability motive and drive. But nevertheless, they are an essential part of learning about how you might manage processes like this better.
It's a normal part of the software development cycle that at project closeout you hear everyone's views about what went right, what went wrong, and it would be an important part of our learning, I think, Convener, if we could hear some of that perspective at some point in the future too.
Thank you. Do members have any further questions? And if not, I'd like to thank the Auditor General and your colleagues for your evidence this morning. I now close the public part of this meeting as the committee moves into private session.